All right, now into our part two of the Dualism and Materialism lecture. Today, in this lecture, we're going to look at what's called the divisibility argument. It was an argument introduced by René Descartes, a 17th century French philosopher who I hope you've all heard of. He's famous for the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," but he was contributed a lot more than just that. He was, in addition to being a philosopher, he was a mathematician, a physicist, who made all sorts of progress in the science of optics. For those of you who have taken algebra, he's responsible for Cartesian coordinates. Ever heard of that? So let's just get on to his argument. And I'm going to go through a long quote, which, again, these PowerPoints, this isn't a book, and you should have done the reading, so you should have read this before. And as well as these PowerPoint slides will be on the Blackboard website, so it's worth reading through it again. But I'm going to read through this quote, and then we're going to pull out the argument from it. So bear with me. Descartes writes, "To commence this examination accordingly, I here remark, in the first place, that there is a vast difference between mind and body, in respect that body, from its nature, is always divisible, and that mind is entirely indivisible. For in truth, when I consider the mind, that is, when I consider myself insofar only as I am a thinking thing, I can distinguish in myself no parts, but I very clearly discern that I am somewhat absolutely one and entire. And although the whole mind seems to be united to the whole body, yet when a foot, an arm, or any other part is cut off, I am conscious that nothing has been taken from my mind. Nor can the faculties of willing, perceiving, conceiving, etc. properly be called its parts. For it is the same mind that is exercised all entire in willing and perceiving and in conceiving." And he goes on, "But quite the opposite holds in corporeal or extended things. For I cannot imagine any one of them, how small soever it may be, which I cannot easily sunder in thought, and which therefore I do not know to be divisible. This would be sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body, if I had not already been surprised of it on other grounds." All right. I've got a reconstruction of that lengthy passage of the argument. Here it is. It's pretty simple, actually. Premise 1, my body is divisible. Premise 2, my mind, myself, insofar as I am a thinking thing, is not divisible. So, my mind is distinct from my body. By Leibniz's law, there's something true of the body that's not true of the mind, and vice versa. They cannot be numerically identical, so they're not the same thing. That's his basic argument. Well, let's evaluate the premises in turn. This argument, if it's going to succeed, obviously has to have true premises. So let's start with the first premise. Well, that seems pretty evident. Your body just does seem to be dividable. You can cut your fingernails, your hair, you can have your arm amputated. Further, even if you lose some parts of your body, such as your toe or arm, you still have your body, even though it's just changed. There's just been parts divided from it. So I don't think that needs much more defense. And also, premise 1 isn't just true of your body, it's true of all physical bodies. We can cut them up in many different ways. But there's one substantial problem. Let's take a look at premise 2 then. And I'm going to think there's a problem with premise 2. So my mind or myself, insofar as my thinking thing, is not divisible. Well, what's the problem with that? How does Descartes defend it? That's the problem. It's not maybe obvious that the mind is indivisible. Even though it's obvious, premise 1 is obvious, premise 2 just doesn't seem obvious at all. So the problem is Descartes can't just assert premise 2. He's got to give an argument for premise 2. All right. Well, he does. And yet, what does he write? He says, "When I consider my mind, or myself insofar as I'm merely a thinking thing, I am unable to distinguish any parts within myself. I understand myself to be something quite single and complete." So Descartes appealing to the first-person perspective that I talked about in part 1 of this lecture. He basically claims that given that it is impossible for me, Descartes, to imagine that my mind can be divided, it is impossible for my mind to be divided. So mind, unlike body, is indivisible. How successful is this argument? Well, the materialist has an immediate objection. If you're familiar with René Descartes and his philosophical writings, then you can come up with an objection to this argument from other claims that Descartes makes elsewhere. So the materialist can respond to Descartes' objection by criticizing the move from what is not imaginable to what is not possible. And they can do this by, again, drawing to a distinction that Descartes himself draws. So Descartes writes, I apologize again, this is a lengthy quote, and to render this quite clear, I remark, in the first place, the difference that subsists between imagination and pure intellection or conception. For example, when I imagine a triangle, I not only conceive, intelligo, that it is a figure comprehended by 3 lines, but at the same time also I look upon these 3 lines as present by the power and internal application of my mind. And this is what I call imagining. But if I desire to think of a chiliagon, I indeed rightly conceive that it is a figure composed of 1,000 sides, as easily as I conceive that a triangle is a figure composed of only 3 sides. But I cannot imagine the 1,000 sides of a chiliagon as I do the 3 sides of a triangle, nor, so to speak, view them as present with the eyes of my mind. So, I'm going to skip these next 2 quotes, but they're on the slides. He draws a distinction then between imagining and conceiving. Here's the thrust of the passage then. Close your eyes and imagine a triangle, alright? Pretty easy, right? It's just 3-sided polygon, right? Alright, now do the same thing. Form a mental image. Imagine a 1,000-sided figure. So instead of 3 sides, it's 1,000 sides. Try to do it. Not so easy, right? You have a mental image in there probably, but now imagine a 1,001-sided figure and compare that to your mental image of a 1,000-sided figure. Probably not any difference that you can detect. Our imagination just isn't that powerful. But you could certainly have a concept of a 1,000-sided figure, even if you can't imagine it. I mean, of course we have concepts of 1,000-sided figures. Geometricians do it all the time. We're capable of all sorts of concepts like that. We could have a concept of a 1,000,000-sided figure if we wanted to, even if we can't imagine it. So, if Descartes then really means that he can't imagine himself divided, that, on that reasoning alone, doesn't entail that it's impossible that he be divided. But what if instead Descartes claims that he can't conceive of himself being divided instead? Well, that would be more powerful, and that's what Descartes actually needs to claim. He can't claim that he can't imagine it. He needs to have an argument for why he can't conceive of his self being divided. If he could do this, this would have a lot more promise. For a person's experience can only have one perspective at a time. So, yeah, I think this actually is quite plausible. I think you can develop an argument for this, and I'm about to show you what it is. It's not an argument that Descartes gives, but we're going to give it on behalf of Descartes. So, again, your experience can only have one perspective at a time. Oh, I've got some emails. So, for example, you can imagine what it is like to be a football player. But try to imagine what it's like to be a football team. You can't do it. You can imagine what it's like to be a member of a football team, and then you can imagine a football team, but you can't imagine what it is like to be a football team. Further, from this first-person point of view, when you introspect about yourself, or, for example, I introspect about myself, you and I cannot make sense of the idea that your mind is composed of parts. That is, I cannot conceive of a number of distinct things somehow unified to compose my mind unless I, this unified single thing, conceive it, this undivided thing. So, we'll say it's impossible for me to think of my own mind as composed of parts, since that very thought would already presuppose my mind doing the thinking about those many parts. I won't elaborate this any further. If I was a good instructor, perhaps I would, but sometimes I want my students to think on their own. So if you are puzzled by this, but want to understand it, then just go back to these PowerPoint slides, go back to the book, and think it through. Or continue to take philosophy classes. If you take, for example, philosophy of mind, we'll go way into the depth on this. So the materialists will grant, perhaps, that I cannot imagine or conceive of my mind as composed of parts, or myself as halved, but they could still deny the consequence that it is impossible that my mind be divided into parts. So they'll say, well, it may not be possible to conceive from the first-person perspective, perhaps from the third-person perspective, you can conceive that the mind has parts, so it's dividable. So then you have the basis to say that the mind's not identical to the brain. Well, In response to the materialist, there is a thought experiment. And let's do this thought experiment together. In this thought experiment, well, actually, before we go to this thought experiment, though, this is what the materialists will say. I am identical to my brain. My brain can be split. As my brain can be split, so can I be split. That would be the materialist response. If the mind is identical to the brain, then as the brain can be split, so can the mind be split. And surgeons successfully remove the right or left half of human brains all the time, and the patients wake up. They're still there, still walking around, talking and everything. Sometimes without any significant changes to the personality. So that's another way to challenge premise 2 then. But, and like I said, this thought experiment will ultimately be on behalf of Descartes, and it will ultimately, I think, give a pretty plausible defense of the premise. So this objection at first glance then isn't going to be that obviously successful, and here's why. Suppose a mad scientist kidnaps you. Sheldon, for example. And he puts you under anesthesia, and then once under anesthesia, he takes the left half of your brain and places it in a human body whose brain was removed. We'll call the body with your left brain Pat. You know, Pat. The mad scientist then will place the right half of your brain in a different body. We'll call the body with your right brain Stu. Stu. So then the mad scientist destroys your original body. So much for that. Several hours later, both Pat and Stu wake up. Now, all your memories, emotions, dispositions, personality quirks, let's suppose they were preserved in both the left and right half of the brain. So when both Pat and Stu wake up, they have your memories, your tastes, your preferences, your beliefs, and everything else that could be said about you. Okay? Question. Which one is you, Pat or Stu? Think about it. Well, there are 3 options. Option 1, both Pat and Stu are you. Option 2, only one of the two, Pat or Stu is you. Option 3, neither Pat nor Stu are you. We'll start with option 1. Option 1 just doesn't work. Both Pat and Stu can't be you. Here's why. Identity is transitive. So if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals B. This is like algebra. This is just basic. If A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is identical to C. That's a typo, actually. I'm sorry. So that should be a C right there. But you still get the idea. So if Pat is identical to you, and you are identical to Stu, then Pat would be identical to Stu. But that can't be the case by Leibniz's law. For example, upon awakening, Pat's over here and Stu's over there. So, that option 1 doesn't work. Oh yes, that's where Stu would be anyways. This must be a couple years old, because I think that affair is old news. I apologize. I'll try to do better with staying on top of the pop culture trends. Alright, problem with option 2. Recall option 2. Only one of the two, Pat or Stu, is you. Well, which one is it? Pat or Stu? They both believe they're you. They act like you. They have the same tastes as you. They have the same memories as you. Seems like there's no good criteria. Right, well that just leaves the third option. Neither of them are you. Well, problems with that. I apologize for the tiny print. We'll work through this one bullet one at a time, and we'll respond to this option with another thought experiment. Suppose instead that the mad scientist split your brain in half, took it out, and placed it back in your skull. You'd have no problem saying that the you that woke up after getting the brain put in it was you, okay? That's not a problem. So the mad scientist takes your brain out, cuts it in half, but then he puts it back in your skull and puts it back together. And then you wake up in your original body and you say, oh, it's me. But suppose also that the mad scientist removed half your brain, but ensured that your memories, etc. are in the half of the brain that remained in your skull. So then, once again, when you wake up, you'd say you woke up, even though half your brain was missing. However, suppose once again, the mad scientist, upon finding out that your current body was about to die, made a duplicate but healthy version of your body, same eye color, fingerprints, etc., and then scooped out your brain and then placed it in a new body. Well, you wake up in a body that's a lot like the old one, with the same brain. You look in the mirror and, oh, it's me! So again, you'd have no problem saying that was you with a new body. Now, finally suppose that the mad scientist only placed half the brain in the new body, destroyed your old body with the half of the brain left, and then destroyed your old body with the half of the brain left in it. Once again, you wake up in a new body and you'd say, ah, it's me. I just have a new body. All right. Reflect for a moment then. Suppose now you've been kidnapped by the mad scientist. You're sitting in the chair, you're nervously waiting for the operation. In that chair, you have to ask yourself, are you really in a position to know what will happen to you? It might be that neither Pat nor Stu will be you, and the operation will just destroy the original person once and for all. The operation will result in two new persons, neither of which are you, but believe they are you. They're clones or duplicates, but that's not you. It won't be numerically identical to you. So think of a duplicating machine. You step into it and then poof, an exact duplicate of you emerges in the other room. That person is very similar to you and believes they're you, but they're not you. So you're still walking around and there's a duplicate of you. All right? And that's just true by Leibniz's law. So perhaps you'll wake up in Pat or Stu's body, but only one of the two's body. I don't know. It may be that neither Pat or Stu will be you. The operation will destroy the original person once and for all. The operation will then result in two new persons, neither of which are you, but believe that they're you. So again, duplicate machine. You step into it. Oh, I just read all this stuff. I'm going to read it again. So, reflection on this thought experiment shows that however much you may know about what happened to your brain, you may know exactly what happened to every single atom in it. You don't necessarily know what has happened to you. So you can't just think about what's going on with the brain and then know what's going to happen to you. Whether or not you will still exist, whether you'll be in Pat or Stu's body, you don't know. You can know everything there is to know about the brain, and you still don't know what is going to happen to you once you go under the operating table and the mad scientist removes your brain. Okay? So Descartes can respond that reflection on this thought experiment shows that there's got to be something more to you than just your matter, your body and your brain. There's got to be this further and essential immaterial part whose continuing existence makes the brain and body to which it is connected your brain and your body. All right, that was a fun thought experiment.